At 10:50 local time, a Chinese Navy helicopter approached a United States Navy destroyer with a mission, forced the American warship to change course and prove that Beijing still calls the shots in these waters. The pilot's orders were simple on paper, but loaded with political theater. Get close, record everything, and make sure the footage looked like dominance. What happened next proved that China's greatest weapon wasn't its hardware, but its hubris. Inside the destroyer's Combat Information Center, American sailors watched their radar screens with a mix of disbelief and mild amusement. The ship's AN-SPY radar, a phased array system capable of tracking ballistic missiles in space, was now locked on a lumbering helicopter that looked like it had been pulled from a Cold War museum exhibit. What was supposed to be an act of intimidation had become a live demonstration of technological mismatch. Before we begin, make sure to hit like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. The Chinese helicopter had three clear objectives. First, gather intelligence on US naval operations and radar behavior. Second, force a visible course change to create the illusion of American retreat. And third, capture video evidence to feed state television a ready-made story of victory. But this wasn't 1987, and the destroyer wasn't a helpless tanker stumbling through contested waters. This was an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, a 10,000-ton slab of weaponized precision. 90 vertical launch cells stood below deck, loaded with a mix of standard missiles, tomahawks, and anti-submarine rockets. 4 gas turbines generated 100,000 horsepower, pushing the ship past 30 knots with frightening ease. At its heart beat the Aegis Combat System, a neural network of sensors and processors that could track over 100 aerial targets while engaging multiple threats at once. Against that backdrop, the Chinese helicopter might as well have been a dragonfly harassing a freight train. The ship's combat computer assigned the approaching aircraft a track number and immediately labeled it low threat. Algorithms began building engagement solutions anyway. It's what they're designed to do, offering options from long-range standard missiles, medium-range evolved Sea Sparrows, or the Phalanx CIWS for last-ditch defense. If this had been wartime, the entire encounter would have ended in under 30 seconds. Radar locks, illuminator paints, missile launch, target becomes metallic confetti. But this was peacetime. You don't vaporize a stunt. You let it play out and make sure your data recorder's running. The helicopter's radar, an outdated Doppler system, screamed across the spectrum like a foghorn from another century. Its primitive emissions were picked up instantly by the destroyer's AN/SLQ-32 electronic warfare suite, a digital fingerprint collector that catalogs every frequency, pulse, and waveform an adversary sends into the void. Every signal told a story, the story of the helicopter's hardware, its radar age, its operator habits. The Americans were fluent in this language. Within seconds, the destroyer had captured enough data to build a detailed profile that could later be used to jam, spoof, or blind that same system. The Chinese crew didn't realize it, but they were handing over their secrets with every radar ping. What took a minute to analyze today would become instant identification tomorrow. Inside the helicopter, things were less elegant. The cockpit was a vibrating symphony of aging metal and warning lights. The pilot wrestled with the collective and cyclic, fighting turbulence and the mechanical groans of an overworked airframe. The instrument panel flickered like a cheap arcade machine. Replacement parts for this model had been out of production for years, and maintenance had long been more art than science. The pilot checked his fuel gauge and frowned. At this burn rate, keeping pace with the destroyer's 30-knot march and fighting headwinds, he had maybe 45 minutes on station. That was optimistic. If both engines held, he'd be lucky to make it back to base without a tow. Meanwhile, inside the destroyer, the crew treated the situation as low-budget entertainment. Radar operators tracked the helicopter lazily, watching it slow crawl toward the ship's position. The bridge logged the approach in measured tones. The Phalanx CIWS rotated smoothly to track the target, but the barrels stayed cold. The system was built to shoot down supersonic sea-skimming missiles, threats that closed in faster than a blink, not antique helicopters lurching at 100 knots. The Aegis console flagged the helicopter's emissions as priority negligible. One sailor joked, "This is like using a supercomputer to play tic-tac-toe." The combat team chuckled, and the captain allowed herself a thin smile. As the helicopter drifted closer, the destroyer's intelligence team grew eager. To them, this was a live gift from the adversary's toolbox. Every transmission, every radar pulse, every navigation beacon was data. They could refine jamming algorithms, improve countermeasure timing, and update electronic threat libraries across the entire Pacific Fleet. Somewhere deep in the ship's digital brain, algorithms were already identifying the helicopter's personality, the microscopic quirks that make every emitter unique. The Americans didn't just see the helicopter, they were learning it. Then came the classic harassment tactic. The helicopter dropped to 500 feet, cutting toward the destroyer's bow in a low, aggressive pass. Textbook intimidation maneuver: fly close enough to seem threatening, provoke a reaction, and record the whole thing for propaganda. The goal wasn't combat, it was cinema. A clip of a warship reacting, maybe flinching, would be worth gold back home. But through the scratched plexiglass windscreen, the pilot saw nothing of the sort. The destroyer didn't flinch. It didn't change speed or heading, just endless gray steel carving its way through green water, perfectly steady. The pilot keyed his mic. "American warship, you are approaching Chinese territorial waters. Change course immediately." His voice cracked slightly through the static. On board the destroyer, the communications team recorded every syllable. The bridge crew listened, amused. They were in international waters, confirmed by navigation, GPS, and common sense. After a brief pause, a female officer responded over the radio with surgical calm. "Unidentified aircraft. This is a United States warship operating lawfully in international waters. Recommend you maintain safe distance." It was the kind of voice that could cut granite. The room smirked. The professionalism stung more than any missile. The SLQ-32 continued its quiet harvest. The Chinese helicopter's every electronic emission was being dissected in real time. Their communication equipment was primitive, unencrypted, operating on commercial aviation bands that could have been intercepted by a hobbyist with a radio scanner. The destroyer's electronic warfare officer shook his head. "They're basically broadcasting on an open mic," he muttered. "And we're recording the concert." Every pulse, every transmission became ammunition for future encounters. Knowledge is power, and power loves data. Around 10:55, the destroyer's Link 16 tactile network came alive. Every ship, aircraft, and asset within range now saw the same air track. The helicopter's position, heading, and emissions were mirrored across the entire battle group. Think of Link 16 as an encrypted, perfectly synchronized group chat, one where each participant gets a precise time slot to speak, ensuring no confusion, no overlap, and no mistakes. The destroyer shared what it saw, and the carrier hundreds of miles away saw it instantly. The helicopter thought it was dancing for one audience. It was on stage before an entire fleet. Inside the helicopter, the atmosphere shifted from bravado to anxiety. The fuel gauge sank like a stone. The engines, aging turboshafts once praised for reliability, coughed in protest. The flight engineer gestured to the numbers, silently urging the pilot to break off. The pilot hesitated. His orders were to complete the pass, capture the shot, make the message, but the math was getting uglier. Every second spent circling the destroyer ate into their safety margin for return. The destroyer's system stayed silent, but the math inside its computers didn't stop. Fire control solutions updated continuously, plotting closure rates, target profiles, and worst-case contingencies. Even if the crew ignored the threat, the machine never did. It knew exactly how to end the encounter, down to the millisecond, if ordered. The Phalanx CWS could throw 4,500 tungsten rounds per minute. Against a helicopter moving slower than a sports car, the engagement window was embarrassingly one-sided. The helicopter made one last desperate pass, from stern to bow this time, hovering close enough for the crew to make out sailors on deck. They weren't scrambling to battle stations. They weren't even watching. One sailor simply waved, a lazy flick of the wrist, before returning to deck work. The insult was devastating. Not a show of fear, but of indifference. The destroyer's defensive systems remained on standby, sensors locked but safeties engaged. The American ship was showing perfect composure, unshakable, unbothered, unflinching. The pilot keyed his mic again. "This is your final warning. Change course now." His voice wavered. On the bridge, the communications officer muted her mic and grinned. "He sounds nervous." The destroyer didn't respond. Its scheduled navigational course change came right on time, completely unrelated to the helicopter's antics. But to the pilot, it looked like a concession. He banked away, convinced he'd forced a retreat. Mission accomplished, he thought. By the time the helicopter limped home, low on fuel and high on self-congratulation, the Americans had already finished analyzing the entire encounter. Every radar pulse, every voice transmission, every flicker of emissions had been dissected and stored. Within hours, analysts ashore would integrate that data into jamming and spoofing libraries. The next time that helicopter type appeared on radar, American systems would recognize and neutralize it before the crew even realized they'd been detected. The Chinese had given away far more than they had gained. By evening, Chinese state television aired the inevitable segment. Dramatic music, tight camera angles, selective editing. The footage showed the destroyer turning, the narrator proclaiming that an American warship had been driven from Chinese waters. The facts didn't matter. The propaganda did. What state media wouldn't mention was that the course change had been planned hours earlier, or that the helicopter barely made it back to base with fumes in its tanks. The story would be hailed as proof of power, while the real victory, measured in data, not headlines, belonged to the Americans. Back aboard the destroyer, the crew reviewed the recordings in the Combat Information Center. The intelligence officers archived the emissions, the radar team logged the flight path, and the bridge crew laughed quietly at the day's absurdity. Every sailor understood what had really happened. A foreign power had spent precious flight hours and fuel to give the US Navy a free intelligence upgrade. No shots fired, no alarms, just information, the most valuable currency in modern warfare. The encounter became another entry in the quiet, invisible chess match that defines the modern Pacific. It was a lesson in restraint, in patience, and in the art of letting your opponent make mistakes in front of you. Power isn't about who shouts the loudest. It's about who learns the most. Remember to hit like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. Your support means a lot.